Hi, this is Paul, and I want to make a couple of videos on the Jordan Peterson, Matt Dillahunty debate or conversation. It's really more of a conversation that wasn't set up as a debate, and I think we should call this a conversation. I've watched it a few times, and each time I watch it, some of my thoughts about it get clearer. And one of the things that I think it's important to recognize is that a point that I've made often is that hierarchies filter as much as they enable. And by enable, I mean enable access. These two would not be talking to each other if they hadn't both reached a certain level of celebrity, of visibility in terms of their own respective hierarchies. And I think that in some ways often disables a good conversation because while Jordan Peterson is preparing for his conversation with Sam Harris, he hasn't digested all of Dillahunty. And Dillahunty hasn't digested all of Jordan Peterson. And so a lot of what we see in this conversation is because I don't know that these two are knowing where each other is coming from. I think just because of the relationship between materialism and phenomenology, Peterson probably has a little bit better take on where Dillahunty's coming from. I don't know about Dillahunty here. So right away, the conversation begins on the question, is there a God? Now, Jordan Peterson regularly responds to, do you believe in God with, it depends on what you mean by believe, and it depends on what you mean by God. Now, Dillahunty and many others are responding and saying, that's a dodge. You know very well what we mean by these things. And I think Peterson does very well know what we mean by these things, but because of Peterson's own philosophical convictions, to use those words in that manner would be, in Jordan Peterson's words, it would kind of be lying. It would, that's not the conventional use of the word lie. It would be misleading to say, I believe in God, and to have that understood in what I would say would be the majority case assumption within our culture, which I think continues to be a primary materialistic conception of epistemology and ontology. And with Jordan Peterson's phenomenology, that's impacting his epistemology, and his pragmatism, which is impacting his ontology, this is where the confusion lies. And so, many say, dispense with that and answer the question directly. And in a sense, this is where we go if we don't take a step back and Peterson says, well, this is what I mean by believe. Put in the pragmatism. This is what I mean by God. Put in the pragmatism and the phenomenology with the agnostic open ceiling. Now, what does Dillahunty mean by God? Now, he regularly talks about himself as formerly a fundamentalist Southern Baptist. And so I haven't listened to a lot of Dillahunty's things. And if any of you are big fans of his and there are one or two videos of his that you would recommend me to hear, I'm very interested. He says, I was going to give my skeptical, was it a skeptical case for morality? I'd like to hear that. So if that's not on YouTube, point it out to me, and I'd like to watch it. But I'm going to assume kind of your typical American evangelical assumption of God within kind of the dominant philosophical assumptions of our day for most people. That God is an omnipotent, he can do anything, he's omniscient, he knows everything, he's an all-good actor in the world. This is assumed to be a definition of the Christian God. Now, if you take a look at, say, a lot of David Bentley Hart is from the Orthodox tradition, writes some very long books, is a very good writer, very interesting guy. Does Dillahunty get the Christian definition of God right? Now, I want to avoid a lot of intramural Christian bickering about things, because here's part of what makes this complex. Christians always live within a cultural frame, and those cultural frames have within them philosophical assumptions. A lot of the history of the church and philosophy is the interaction between the Bible and those philosophical cultural assumptions that people bring to the Bible and read the Bible within. That is a really big part of what goes on, in my opinion, with these kinds of atheist versus Christian fights that we see happening on YouTube all over. The difficulty is, if the two groups have different philosophical presuppositions and they are not owning those and they are not aware of those philosophical, cultural, assumptive presuppositions will basically mean that people talk past each other. And that is something of what is happening in this conversation. So now David Bentley Hart will say, you know, as will C.S. Lewis, as will Christians throughout the centuries, one of the things that you can usually count on Orthodox scholars to know is a lot of church history, which is really helpful. Many Roman Catholic scholars will too. Many Protestant scholars will too, but Americans tend to be less predisposed to studying history than a lot of other cultures. Americans like to be pragmatic, looking forward. We've got a can-do cultural assumption, whereas many other cultures are quite a bit better in tune with their own histories. So David Bentley Hart and actually C.S. Lewis will say things like, God is not just another thing in the world. And so this is something really important as we get into Dillahunty, because a big part of the argument against the existence of God is we can't lay our hands on him, or we can't lay our eyes on him, and he is invisible, or he is hidden, or, you know, we can't locate him. Okay. David Bentley Hart, C.S. Lewis will say, you know, God is not just another thing in the world. God is the ground of all being. You will hear this said. Now, this is going to, you know, is that pantheism? We're going to have to talk about that. You know, C.S. Lewis makes the comment that trying to find God in the world would be like trying to find Tolkien in Middle-earth. You know, as much as Bilbo wants to find J.R.R. Tolkien, Bilbo never will know J.R.R. Tolkien unless Tolkien writes himself into the story. And actually Dorothy Sayers makes that point in a wonderful book of hers. And in actually one of her stories, Dorothy Sayers writes herself into the story to kind of make that point. In other words, God is not just another character on the stage. God's relationship with us is very different from my relationship with Neil Postman's book. I can pick up Neil Postman's book. It's accessible to me. Now we're going to talk about realism a little bit. It's real to me. Well, why is it real to me? Well, let's keep going. God is also a person, or in the Christian faith, three persons, who acts in the world and relates to humanity within time. And so now if you take, let's say, the Dorothy Sayers analogy of, you know, the author to characters in the story, God, just like Dorothy Sayers writing something in her, you know, in her mystery novels, or Tolkien writing something in his fantasy novels, well, Tolkien and Dorothy Sayers have a tremendous amount of power and authority, there's the word comes from, within those stories, but everything that the characters see is part of the story. And now I'm thinking about also doing a video on natural and supernatural, because that also gets into this. The difficulty that we see is that there's no reason to believe that we could comprehend anything supernatural other than seeing it within a natural frame, because our eyes are natural, our minds are natural. In other words, even if we're to take a look at this differentiation between natural and supernatural, we have no conception what supernatural would look like. So we're going to have to talk quite a bit more about that. What do you mean by God? Well, you know, pantheism, the sum of all things. But Christianity holds that God is three persons. So you have a personal God. Now, Islam and Judaism also have a personal God. He is the source of the world we experience. He can do with it or in it as he pleases. And this is distinct from deism. Deism is the sense that God made the world, but he made these laws in the world, and it just kind of, it's much more of a deterministic manner where, you know, the world just kind of runs its course. Or it's more like a machine. If we are actors in the world, we can poke at the machine and the machine will poke back in predictable ways. Now, deism and providential deism, I mentioned that in my frame video about the Ben Shapiro Jordan Peterson conversation. Charles Taylor believes that part of how we got to where we are over the last 500 years, one of the intermediate steps was a deistic universe. And there's a book out there, The Clock, basically the Clockworks universe. And so Charles Taylor believes that there were stages by which we got here, and that was one of the vital stages. So this is distinct from deism. God does act in the world, and Christians believe a faithful record of his words and deeds are in the Bible as special revelation. And again, Dillahunty he knows this about Christians. Now, I'd love to hear Dillahunty engage more with the question of God as being an object in the world, as differentiated from God as the ground of all being, or, for example, God as the author, Tolkien, how Tolkien relates to Middle Earth. Now, obviously, it's a special kind of story because Bilbo talked to authors about their characters and how their characters become alive. For example, C.S. Lewis, when he was writing Narnia, he'd been actually trying to write this children's story for a long time, and it never worked. And once Aslan came in, and that's the language Lewis uses. Now, this is a little phenomenological. Once Aslan came in, he pulled the story in with him. Well, what does that mean? Well, how does that work? Well, now we're talking phenomenology and psychology, which were much more in Jordan Peterson's camp. Now, the assumption of materialists is that existence are basically objects in space, and this is different from Peterson. This is the fundamental divide. Okay, materialists will say ontology or existence. What is here are objects in space, and these objects are durable. They seem to exist on their own. In other words, if I close my eyes, the book is still here. I can touch it. I can feel it. I open it. I see it. It's exactly like it was. The world seems very durable in this way, and that's a good thing. And the world is very predictable, especially in this, let's say, this Newtonian frame, where actually at coffee break, I haven't eaten these things yet. I don't know if I'm going to eat them, but the coffee break ladies had this little, party in February, and they had, little candies and little gifts for everyone. And so, I always show up and eat their food. So they, I got a little gift that's been sitting on my table. My room is a mess because things are durable. My office is a mess. My bedroom is clean. My closet is incredibly well sorted. But things are durable because that's how the world is. And so this is kind of a common sense realism that, here are things right here. So Dillahunty assumes a realism. Objects or beings exist in and of themselves. Now, this is exactly where C.S. Lewis begins the book Miracles. And I haven't given up on this book, but, I want to continue processing this because the main leap that Lewis takes in this book is really hard, often for materialists to conceive of. And so chapter 2, he begins the naturalist and the supernaturalist. Gracious Mrs. Snip, and is there a place where people venture to live above ground? I've never heard of people living underground, replies Tim. Before I came to Giant Land. Came to Giant Land, called Mrs. Snip. Why isn't everywhere Giant Land? And that little I forget what those things are called above the chapters. This is, this illustrates that, a function about we human beings. We live within our own cultures and we're embodied within our own cultures, and our assumptions are within our own cultures. And I'm a pretty determined presuppositionalist. These presuppositions govern things, all the way up, all the way down. And so if this, one of the people at our last meetup said, I think everybody should live for a year in a third world country, a year at a minimum. It'll tremendously change your assumptions about the world to live in another culture. C.S. Lewis begins. I use the word miracle to mean the interference with nature by supernatural power. Okay, so in a sense, Lewis is adopting the language. That is a very debatable language, but is adopting the language for the sake of the argument. Say, this is what we're going to talk about. Unless there exists, in addition to nature, something else which we call the supernatural, there can be no miracles. Some people believe that nothing exists except nature. I call those people naturalists. Others think that besides nature there exists something else. I call them supernaturalists. Our first question, therefore, is whether the naturalists or the supernaturalists are right. And here comes our first difficulty. Well, we have difficulty with the definition. And so if you look at the Jordan Peterson Dillahunty argument, Dillahunty is in a sense approaching this kind of in the same world as Lewis. And Dillahunty is saying, hey, all there is nature. And he in the video says, I don't know that we can measure the supernatural, so technically I have to stay on the agnostic side of the supernatural. But I think for that reason, the assumptions about knowledge of the supernatural or from the supernatural are impermissible in public thought and are not justifiable philosophically or rationally. That's, in a sense, the argument. Now, there's a lot behind that argument. One of the courses I hung around Calvin College to take from Nick Waltersdorf back in the 80s was the work of Nick Waltersdorf and Alvin Plantinga, where one of the things that they do is they say, but that argument presupposes some ideas about justifiable knowledge, and those look much more like presuppositions than something that you have reasons for. And this is why, again, you'll see Peterson in this video often challenging Dillahunty. You know, you say you need reasons for everything. Well, I'm thinking you're sneaking things in that you don't have reasons for. And there are some things that you believe are self-evident. Well, what if I doubt that those things are in fact self-evident? Well, then suddenly you're like this again. So there's an ontological presupposition below here, and I'm getting a phone call. No, looks like they gave up. Good. There's an ontological presupposition here. And is reality this thing that exists on its own? Now remember from C.S. Lewis, and he's exactly right, and Dillahunty wouldn't agree, this book is in a sense on its own now, but this book has been dependent historically on this long chain of events that we can take all the way back to the Big Bang. Okay? Now, we can't explain the Big Bang. We can try to figure out where it got there, but that's like that old adage, give me one miracle and I'll explain the rest. So this book came about after a long history of things, and there's all the technology and the learning and it's all here. But now that this book is dependent on that huge chain of events that we call history, and this book is durable. If I die, my children can inherit this book. If I close my eyes and open my eyes, the book is exactly where it is. This is, in a sense, a referential realism. Now, the difficulty we have here is the relationship between my experiencing the book and the book itself. And this is where, in a little bit, we're going to get into Descartes. Could I be dreaming right now? Could I be having a hallucination? Maybe I'm in a coma. Maybe I'm in we had a debate like this in our Jordan Peterson meetup group. Could I be in the midst of a tremendously powerful virtual reality program where I'm strapped into something? Or could I be plugged into the matrix and I'm only imagining I'm experiencing this, whereas I'm really being a battery for this great machine and I'm being fooled? And can I really know the difference when, this sense of realism, I'm touching this book, I'm smelling this book, but all of those things have to be mediated by this not so non-complicated mechanism, my eyes, my touch, my hands. And this is where materialism started to die a philosophical death. It's derived its existence from the singularity. It's durable in and of itself, not dependent upon anything else except that from which it derives its existence in moments x minus 1. So if now is moment x, x minus 1 regressing back, well, that's the whole history thing. We have the capacity to see objects as they are. That's the monarchical vision. But now you cue Descartes. Now Descartes said things like, well, what if I'm under the influence of a demon? And now we listen to that and we say, what kind of argument is that? Well, what if I'm in the Matrix? We tend to buy that argument a little bit easier than we buy the Descartes demon argument. Now, Dillahunty asks if there is evidence that there is a being that we call God with those attributes that we've mentioned that is out there with all the other things. Does God exist? That's, in a sense, the idea of the question. The question is there a being out there named God? Can we have evidence for such a being? Can we have sufficient evidence for such a being? Now, this is where we're going to start to creep into Peterson territory. Can we have evidence for such a being so as to impact our public world? See, it's that trailer on the question that usually doesn't get mentioned. Because if I would sit down with Dillahunty and say, well, I believe in the Tooth Fairy, and I believe in Santa Claus, and he lives in the North Pole, and, he's up there, and every time the satellite comes over, Santa hides, or he's underground, or he has the power of invisibility, or, I can make up arguments forever why we can't find Santa Claus because he's hidden. Well, this is in a sense the argument. But I would say Santa Claus is out there. And Dillahunty would say, hey, if you want to believe in Santa Claus, go right ahead, but don't let Santa Claus determine how you vote or whether children should be taught evolution or whether we should do sex education in schools or whether gay marriage should be legal. Because right away, most people, they don't really care what you believe as long as you don't bother anybody and you leave it to yourself. But you start monkeying around with politics, they get annoyed. And if you go back in my old videos to the one where I talked about where I showed Richard Dawkins on Justin Brierley's Unbelievable program, listen to that podcast and you'll hear Richard Dawkins talk to a Jewish scholar and an evangelical Christian, and you'll hear Richard Dawkins say, well, I didn't really write my books against you because you seem like nice, reasonable Christians. It's all those people in Kansas and in the deep red states that want to have, that don't want to believe in God and want to ban abortion and want to criminalize abortion and ban same-sex marriage and not teach evolution in schools. Those are the enemies. So in other words, believe what you want, but don't take it out into the public sphere. When you make that move, you already give up some of your game to the pragmatists because you say, you know what? You can have your beliefs, just don't act on them. Well, now we're beginning to open the door to Peterson because now Peterson is saying, oh, we're going to talk about how you should behave or how a person should behave or what kinds of norms we have in society for whose speech is admissible and permissible and who's going to be called out and who's going to be silenced and who's going to be deplatformed and all of these kinds of things that we're raging right now. Jordan Peterson's God. Now, Jordan Peterson is going to stick to his phenomenology and his psychology. And if you listen to Jordan Peterson's stuff, he is always giving this disclaimer. I am reading the Bible psychologically. And I am talking, and you'll find it here in this video, I am talking phenomenologically. Well, what does Peterson mean by that? And again, this is kind of how we listen. If we're not really up on all of these things, we just kind of listen. And things that don't impact us, they just kind of wash over our brain. And so we don't listen to that. And then we pay attention when they raise their voice or when the rest of the audience applauses. I mean, as watchers, we are not that sophisticated. Or you might say we practice a high degree of filtering. And while we're listening, we are always listening for that which interests us. And this again gets back into Peterson's college lectures where he'll talk about the fact that we see what we want to see. Well, what about that? Well, it just shows that our filters govern what we take in. And so this is why, for example, Alan Jacobs, in his book How to Think, repeats what many other people have said, is that we should think more slowly. Well, what does that mean? It means that if you want to understand this video, you should probably listen to it a number of times. Now you might say, well, I don't want to listen to it a number of times. Well, that probably means you're not that interested in it. So if you really want to learn from it, you should listen to it a number of times. And if you really want to understand it, you should probably study. And you might say, well, that's going to take a lot of time. Yeah, it will. And now we're into Malcolm Gladwell territory that if you actually want to be an expert on something, it's going to take 10,000 hours. And so if you want to be an expert on Jordan Peterson, get working. Or if you want to be an expert on celebrity atheists, get working, because this takes time. And so the benefit of hopefully you're listening to me and listening to this YouTube is, well, maybe I can learn a little bit from Paul and watch it through his eyes, and maybe I can learn something and elevate what I see, and so on and so forth. So Jordan Peterson is sticking to his phenomenology and his psychology, and Dillahunty is asking an ontological question that we can't answer because he supposes, this is what Peterson would say, a specific ontology that Dillahunty hasn't owned. And Jordan Peterson has reasons for doubting that we can justify knowing this ontology, knowing this existence. And again, this gets back to Jordan Peterson's stock answer. Do you believe in God? It depends what you mean by believe, and it depends what you mean by God. Because if you're assuming you're listening to me in a modernist frame where these words have particular meaning, my answer is just going to confuse you. Well, here basically you have about an hour of this kind of confusion that he's warning you about, because he's saying Dillahunty has a specific ontology here. When he asks, do you believe in God, he is presupposing that we're sitting in this material world of objects that we see and interact with, and that there's a being out there, a person out there. Now, he's not so naive as to imagine. He understands Christian theology enough to know that most Christians would assume that God is a spirit, a la Epistles of John. And that, okay, does that spirit exist? And does that God, or really a lot of the skepticism that will tend to come from the celebrity atheists, and again, we're opening the door to pragmatism in this, will say, believing in that God doesn't work. Well, what do you mean by work? Well, when I pray and close my eyes and say, Lord, I really want a candy bar, does one appear? And there's the old joke of, there's the poor woman who's just ran out of bread, and she's praying and praying in her room, oh Lord, I'm hungry, I can't eat, please send me bread. And a couple of mischievous little boys are outside listening to it, and they go get a loaf of bread and they throw it in the room, and she's like, my prayers are answered. And the little boy says, what a dupe. Okay, but were her prayers answered? It depends on the frame. And this is where these conversations get tricky. And so Peterson would walk into this story and say, phenomenologically, her prayers were answered from her perspective. Phenomenologically, God heard her prayer, and God was very real to her, and pragmatically, it worked. Now, the ontologist will say, yeah, but I don't believe that this message that she had went all the way up to God, because what? Because bread would be produced? Yeah, because we're kind of thinking stones to bread. But, okay, but could it also be that the author of the story wrote those little boys into listening, and hence the bread came, and hence her faith was reinforced? And you say, yeah, but bread doesn't always come. But Christians don't believe bread always comes. Christians don't believe that prayers are always answered as we would want them to. Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane asks to be delivered from the cup, meaning the cross, that he's about to endure, and it doesn't happen. And so, well, if God's not going to listen to Jesus' prayer, why should he listen to ours? Well, that's an argument, but again, it's, in a sense, Peterson always says, the celebrity atheists aren't taking Christians seriously enough. Well, okay, you can be the judge of that. Peterson comes at it with Husserl. And again, I've mentioned Matt Thorsby and his YouTubes on phenomenology. Basically, phenomenology comes along with the problem, with Descartes' problem, and says, okay, so I'm having an experience of holding this book right now, and I believe that I'm holding this book. I believe I'm talking to my computer, and I'm going to post this on YouTube later, and I believe people will listen to it, and it seems I've got a lot of reasons to believe in this. But what I'm not paying any attention to is the very complex chain of mechanisms by which I am experiencing this that go far beyond just it happening. I mean, there's complex things. I mean, is this book black? Well, actually, or is this shade blue? Well, actually, that area, physics will tell us, are all the colors except this. That is the only color that's not being, I hope I get this right, that's the only color that's not being absorbed. So that's how I can see it. So, well, what am I to make of that? In other words, this experience I'm having is very complicated. And again, if you listen to Peterson's stuff, he will go on to mention, yeah, and when I'm telling the story like this, I'm focusing on this book. You know what I'm not focusing on at all? My hand. And in other words, in a sense, I see this book because I'm looking for it. And I see things in my office according to what is meaningful to me, what are obstacles and tools. And this again, do we see objects or do we see tools? Now, again, the materialist will say, well, you can believe whatever you want to believe. Don't just take it into the public square. Don't just act on it. Well, okay. But that now you're saying it's what's really important is what I'm acting on. Well, now we're opening the door to the pragmatist, because now Peterson is going to say, yeah, but what is really real here? Because this can be a hallucination. This can be in the matrix. This can be a whole lot of things. Your materialism is built on a lot of assumptions that, quite frankly, a lot of science has really undercut. And this is why Peterson calls them Newtonians. In my natural supernatural video that I'm contemplating, I'm going to bring in some course in 20th century science where we're going to talk about, what happened in terms of the quantum and how that gets into the conversation. And on one hand, I'm sitting here holding this book and I believe, well, this book is very solid. Well, 99% of the 99% of an atom is empty space. Well, why does this book feel very solid? Well, when actually all the atoms, and that's really a rather outdated term in and of itself, all the atoms are 99% empty space, yet this doesn't feel like empty space at all. In other words, can I trust my experience of holding up this book philosophically? Can I justify it? Is it real? And I think a lot of materialists would say, hey, it's real enough. And Peterson would say, gotcha. It's real enough. It's real enough for what? Well, okay. Well, now we're into it. So what is real? Well, what can we know to be real? And if you're a thoroughgoing skeptic, you could say not a lot. In fact, almost nothing. So now we go all the way back to Descartes. I'm having an experience, so at least there must be something that's having the experience. There must be a subject here upon which something is happening. Well, what is real is that which causes me to act. And so, is Matt Dillahunty real? Now, maybe Matt Dillahunty is an actor whose entire life is a lie. Well, let's talk about Milo Yiannopoulos. I think a lot of people look at Milo Yiannopoulos and say, he's not real. He's a gay Roman Catholic Jew. It's an act. He's not real. Well, upon which do we say he's real? Well, I assume, I've never met him in person. I've never shaken his hand. I assume he's a real person. I assume Matt Dillahunty is a real person. Now, I've seen Jordan Peterson on a stage, but I've never shaken his hand. Hopefully, I'll shake his hand in June when he comes to Sacramento. So, what's real? Is Matt Dillahunty real? I have no idea. Was the lunar landing real? Is my experience of sitting in this room real? And what Peterson goes into is that, well, let's think about something complex, like your marriage, your relationship with your wife. Well, is my relationship with my wife real? Well, what happens if I go home today and I find my wife in bed with another man and I say, wait a minute, and they sit up and say, we've been lovers for the 30 years you've been married. Boom. Was my marriage real? Well, marriage is a pretty consequential thing in someone's life. What does it mean for something to be real? And obviously, a marriage, for example, is not a material thing. It's a relational thing. And so, does a marriage have ontology? If so, how so? And this is in a sense where phenomenology and pragmatism come in, and they'll say, marriage is real enough to have dictated your behavior. And apparently, if my wife is not cheating to the best of my knowledge, little disclaimer there, but the man who comes and discovers his cheating wife will say the marriage was a sham, it was never real. And people regularly have experiences where they say such and such was never real. Well, what do you mean by real? Do you mean it was material? What about relational? And in a sense, what phenomenology does is say, well, this relational world is very real and very important, and in some ways more real than the material world. Why do we say it's more real? Because we pay more attention to it. Well, the dissolution of your marriage, when you say it isn't real, is going to have a lot of material consequences, but what is driving what? So, in a sense, what is real is that which causes us to act, like adultery, like a marriage. So in this sense, God is real, even if he doesn't have the ontology that Dillahunty is assuming. And I think even Dillahunty would acknowledge that even if Dillahunty says there is no God, belief in God has been a very real thing throughout the history of the world. So in what sense is God not real? Now, Peterson again and again and again will give his disclaimers and saying, I'm speaking psychologically, I'm speaking phenomenologically. And people will say, I want you to speak ontology. And Peterson will say, I don't know. Well, what does that make him? An agnostic. Now, again, there's a fierce debate out there. Is he being coy with his agnosticism? My take, I'm not Jordan Peterson. I'm going to have to take him at what I've seen in his videos and what others have told me. I think he's being honest. I think he's living within this pragmatic epistemology, which I've drawn in my videos before, and saying, I can't leave this box. I can only know what is real. Okay? You can see that their presuppositional division is yielding a division in what they talk about. So, Dillahunty could say, is God real? And Dillahunty has his materialistic ontological presupposition sitting there, and Jordan Peterson would say, real enough for us to be having this debate. And Dillahunty would, no, that's not my question. And Peterson could very well say, I can't answer your question. And someone would say, well, then why are you two talking? Well, it's a good question. Jordan Peterson continues to maintain agnosticism about the ontology of God. And in a sense, so does Dillahunty when he says we can't measure the supernatural. But what Dillahunty is saying is that we don't have enough evidence for God to justify acting as if God is real in the public sphere. This is where the division is. Because Peterson would say we have to act as if God is real, or we're going to lose the benefits of Western civilization. And Dillahunty would come back and say, oh, but no, I don't believe God is real. And Peterson will come back and say, I think you act like he is. And Dillahunty gets offended. Hey, you want a quick summary of that video? There it is. Still watch the video, but that's essentially what happens. What the phenomenologists say is that materialism is obsolete. It is a failed project because it does not adequately account for the problem of potential deception, that I'm in the matrix holding this book, or that I'm in a simulation, I'm a computer game. See again, Elon Musk's 1 in a billion chance that I'm not in a simulation. Okay. And it fails the test of pragmatism. That again, Dillahunty would say, well, you can believe in a God if you want to, just don't take it into the public square. Your belief isn't justified. Well, justified for what? Well, justified for public action. Okay. That's a frame. Can you account rationally for that entire frame? Well, there's a debate. So phenomenologists will assert that the materialist assumptions are not justified and that they need to be skeptical about their experience and begin with the phenomenon that can't be doubted. So we're back to Descartes, only it's a few hundred years later, and Descartes, who quickly runs back to say, God wouldn't let our senses be fooled. Well, Dillahunty says, I can't go there with you. So where are we at? Now, again, if you listen to the Ben Shapiro thing, a lot of theists will kind of side with Descartes and say, and even Alvin Plantinga, and say, you know, God built into us an ability to know truth. And that's what's functioning when we're using reason and being successful at constructing this world. Now, I would, maybe at some point, I will have a conversation with Alvin Plantinga and find out where he stands on phenomenology. That could be fun. What do you mean by exist? Well, here's a little story. A woman kills herself because she believes her husband has a mistress. Let's assume no such mistress exists. The woman is paranoid. She's insecure. And so she's just so doggone certain that lying, cheating man of his is cheating on her. Now, maybe her father cheated on her mother. And so she's reading into all of these things that this is happening. And so she kills herself. Well, was the mistress real? Well, the mistress was real enough to prompt the wife's suicide. Now, obviously, you see, that's a different sense of ontology. Matt Dillahunty would say the mistress doesn't exist. Well, that's using one philosophical system whereby when we're using these words, the mistress doesn't exist in the same way this book does exist. That's what Dillahunty's saying. Peterson will say, well, the mistress really kind of does exist because the mistress prompted the suicide. Or at least the thought of the mistress. So she was real enough to cause the woman's death. And, you know, think about that in terms of, let's say, close calls in the Cold War. The computer glitch that the Russians had imagining an American first strike could have been real enough for them to order their missiles into the air. Real enough for all of us. Real? Well, depends what you mean by real. Depends what you mean by exist. Now, Jordan Peterson, God and Western Civilization. God has been functional enough in the history of ethics of Sam Harris and Matt Dillahunty to shape it significantly. And Jordan Peterson believes celebrity atheists have not owned up to this. Evidence? I think Peterson has some pretty strong evidence because their ethic isn't significantly enough different from the rest of the culture. In other words, we look at American culture and we say, or Western culture, let's say, Sam Harris's ethics aren't all that different from my ethics, let's say. You might say, oh, well, okay, you know, there are some differences, I'm sure. And if Sam Harris and I were to sit down and make a checklist, but right there when it comes to the checklist, we would begin to see the problem. Because, well, let's say Sam Harris and I are going to make a checklist of our ethics, and we start listing things. Well, here's the problem. Ethics is much more about action than it is about being able to make rules. Now, in the Peterson Dillahunty video, there will be a long section on rulemaking. Well, this is exactly what is getting into this. Peterson, I think quite rightly, says action is a better expression than any list of rules we make about our ethics. And Peterson's justification for this would be Peterson and Dillahunty and Sam Harris can sit well on a stage, and they're probably not going to throw Sam Harris off the stage. They could get angry with him, but they're probably not going to throw him off. Well, where did this come from? Well, it came from being little children. And what Peterson would say is that, all of this has been built into us for hundreds of years. And just because we flip a switch within our materialist ontology, saying we don't believe in this God, doesn't mean that God isn't already embedded, deeply embedded in all of the systems of socialization and acculturation that we have been working out since we have been young. Now, this actually wanders over into the culture war conversations too, because one of the big arguments is, well, patriarchy has spoiled everything, or racism has spoiled everything. Well, okay, I'm sure they've spoiled a lot, but we're not going to be able to disentangle it very easily. And so that then leads to what John McWhorter says, is that what has happened for leaders, for what has happened for black leaders in America, is all they've turned into is pointing out racism. Racism here, racism there. They find racism everywhere. And if you listen to Glenn Loury will say, yeah, but you know what? But they're not really working on building the basics of what it would mean for the black community to thrive. Okay? So where does that leave us? Well, where does that leave us? This again is Peterson's point that Sam Harris and I, or me and Matt Dillahunty, I would say God exists. Matt Dillahunty said God doesn't exist. But you know what? He grew up Southern Baptist. He grew up in the same country. He grew up in the same period. Look at how much agreement there is. In fact, there is so much agreement, to make a list of all the agreements would be difficult. In fact, probably our minds would go to the disagreements, because that's kind of what's in the back of our head. But the reason we can agree is that we're acting together. And that's why Peterson says, well, I'm not so sure you don't believe in God. And of course, Dillahunty, no, I don't believe in God. Materialists continue to live according to all sorts of things that are real, like mistresses in the wife's imagination. Their God-shaped whole is not real enough to change their behavior. Therefore, Peterson will call them atheists in denial. And again, Peterson, when in the debate, Peterson says, you've got to deal with Jung, you've got to deal with Nietzsche, you've got to deal with Dostoevsky. Right there, I think Peterson probably should have paused. Now, playing coulda, woulda, shoulda for something like this is pretty unfair, because I've been in enough situations like we were watching on stage to know that having the presence of mind to say in the moment is really, really hard. And if you roll the tape back and watch it, well, this is why the NFL watches their games and looks at their games all the time. You can do that. And in a sense, when I'm twitching these videos, that's what I'm doing. Okay, let's slow down and take it apart and try to understand. So when Peterson says, hey, look, you're not listening to Jung, you're not listening to Nietzsche, you're not listening to Dostoevsky, especially, I don't know Jung enough, but Nietzsche and Dostoevsky are basically saying, what Peterson is saying is that Christianity has been so built into our practice at the level of our behavior that, you're just imagining you don't believe in God anymore. If that doesn't really change your lifestyle, you don't believe. Now, what's interesting about this argument, it's the flip side of arguments that you will hear pastors make all the time. Unless God gets into your wallet, unless God gets into your life, unless because you believe in God, you change dramatically who you are, you don't believe in God. There's a story of Augustine. Augustine had a very active love life before he became a serious Christian. And one of his mistresses comes up to him and says, Augustine, don't you recognize me? And he's completely ignoring her and blowing her off. And finally she gets in his face, Augustine, it is I. And he looks at her and says, yeah, but it isn't me. I'm not the same man I used to be. Oh, okay. Now put that into a materialist world. Is Augustine the same man he used to be under a materialist perspective? Well, what is Augustine? Well, he's this body, he's this brain. Now we're into this question of what is a human being with X plus 1. A materialist has a harder time dealing with what human beings are. And this is exactly why phenomenology and psychology, and I think this is exactly why Peterson is in many ways, in terms of the watchers in our head, kicking out the slats from under the materialist. And this is why he's increasingly going to be debating the materialist. And this is why a lot of people watching him are now much more open to religion than they used to be, because the materialist world just all seems weaker. Because when Augustine says, it's not me, well, the materialist would say, of course it's you. You were born to your mother and your father. And no, but I am a different person. Well, what do Christians say? I am a new creation. And, well, how is Matt Dillahunty's life different ethically, since he, left Christianity? Maybe he does more drugs, maybe he drinks more. Yeah, well, I know plenty of Christians who drink and do drugs. And some of them feel guilty about it, and some of them don't. And now you might say of those Christians, well, they're betraying their faith by their actions. But again, ethics is far more than a list of rules. Rules can be very helpful things because, again, as Peterson say, we abstract the rules, we look at the rules, and once they're out apart from us, we can say, okay, this rule about adultery, is that a good rule or a bad rule? This rule about marriages between a man and a woman, is that a good rule or a bad rule? This rule about income tax, is that a good rule or a bad rule? Yeah, but we act out what we really believe. Again, pragmatism. So what kind of productive conversation can these two have? Well, I would have liked to have seen them open up a little bit more some of their presuppositions. Now, I think Peterson was trying to do that. But this is really hard to do, especially, okay, Peterson also makes the comment in the video, the frame that we're doing this in is so important. And this, I think, is easy for us to see who are watching the video from the outside. These are two guys on stage. They both have high status. And again, status filters as well as it provides access. But it also, in Jonathan Haidt's words, it binds and it blinds. Well, what does that mean? In terms of their status alone, they've got a lot of reasons to not give points, to not acknowledge. Now, this game is very subtle, and we always all know how this game is played. We'll admit to some things and we'll admit to other things. Why? Because an element of this game is looking for influence with the crowd. And if someone never gives in on a single point or never says they're wrong, we look at them and say they're a liar, because that's untrue to our experience. But they're probably not going to cave on their big points. And so then you might say, well, why are we so excited to hear them talk? Well, we're excited to hear them talk because another element of the game is who wins and who loses. And okay, well, now let's talk about bias, because we'll tend to be biased for one or the other. And so that's why, in a sense, before presidential debates, before the debate, everyone does these games about expectations. They all try to lower expectations, because if you perform above expectation in the moment, you feel a certain way. Now, again, this is part of the reason the materialist grip on our culture continues to weaken. And this is a huge, huge thing, and there are many, many signs in our culture that it is weakening. Could our current president's, let's call it, selective appropriation of factual material be part of that? Well, look at the Sam Harris, Scott Adams conversation. So it seems to me culturally, this is a Jordan Peterson moment, and culturally, the culture is a little bit ready to hear him, and culturally, Dillahunty's on the downside. Now that might annoy some of you. Say, but you Christians are losing anyway. Oh, okay. Let's try. If I want to be a fact-based modernist, let's try to own up to the evidence. And I think there's evidence that materialism's grip on the culture is waning and other things are ascending. So, is that my last slide? Nope, further questions. Does belief in God matter in the materialist conception? Well, that's a long conversation. And again, in what critical respects does Dillahunty's life change since he gave up Christianity? Well, I think that would involve probably a long conversation with Dillahunty. Someone could flip the script on that, and someone says suddenly, I'm a Christian, and other people look at them and say, you don't behave any different. Well, are you a Christian? Well, again, read the beginning of Mere Christianity for some of C.S. Lewis's perspective on that. Culturally, we want to say someone is defined by their action. But we also know that with many of these systems, we are all traitors to our confessions. And it's a very strange thing, as C.S. Lewis points out, that we make these rules that we know we can't keep. Now, what's up with that? Because if someone only makes rules that they know they can keep, we don't have any respect for them. Well, why not? Again, we're looking at action here and behavior. What does the Christian God really care about in terms of how the cultures we are nested in impacts how we imagine God to be and how we relate? This is a question that has been rumbling around in my committee of watchers ever before Jordan Peterson. And the reason for this is because, again, I was a foreign missionary in the Dominican Republic, and I've had significant cross-cultural experience in North America, the African American church, the Dutch CRC church, evangelical churches, and again, getting back to where we started, so we come to faith with these cultural presuppositions. Now, another way, you don't have to move overseas to read this, just read a lot of history and read primary sources and read really good historical scholars. Is my conception of the faith like Augustine's? That's really hard. You could make a good argument that my conception of faith is more like Dillahunty's. And Dillahunty says he's nothing like me because I'm an atheist and he's a Christian. But I could argue culturally we're a lot alike. And Dillahunty and I might have a lot more in common than, let's say, Augustine and I. And nobody's challenging Augustine's credentials. Well, what about Augustine's wedding with Neoplatonism? And what about some of these, what bit of his Manichaean part of his life didn't he sufficiently divorce himself from? And from what neutral position do I imagine I can go through these things? And so again, in this sense, we are all increasingly postmodern in some senses, in that we see the power of the postmodern critique of modernity and say, they've got some real points. But then the question is, where do we go beyond that? And it's in that way that I think Peterson is having an impact on many, many people who are digesting his videos and beginning to say, So Dillahunty says that all those people who want to believe in God can believe in God, but just don't bring it into the public square. In other words, believe in God, but don't act in public like you do. Okay, so does that mean, how much are you really conceding to the pragmatists in that? How critical is this belief or unbelief? Does this just make all of your posturing against the existence of God within an ontological framework of modernism that, is it incidental? And now maybe you're saying that none of you really, maybe Dillahunty is telling me I don't believe in God. And actually, I think he and I could have a really interesting conversation about that. Because this is what pastors say to their parishioners all the time. You don't believe in God enough. Go back and listen to my sermons over the last number of weeks. I tell all of us, we don't believe in the resurrection enough. Well, what do I mean by that? I mean, we don't act as if I really believe in it. Well, what do I mean by that? Jesus, for example, says, do not worry about your life, what you will eat or, or what you will wear. God takes care of the lilies of the field, and aren't you much more important than them? But I might say, yeah, look how long those lilies live. And all you need is somebody walking around trampling them. Ecclesiastes said, God has planted eternity in my heart. Well, I want to live forever. Well, again, here we all go. So, okay, I can sit down with Matt Dillahunty and say, well, what do you think? Do either of us believe? Or are we mostly just products of our culture? Now, let's imagine the kind of Christian God who is both the author of the world. Now, it's a very special authorship, because then we get into, and actually, again, when I listen to Dillahunty, I think he and I have a lot of commonality. When we talk about agency, I mean, when I listen to his description of agency, maybe not in connection with his determinism, when he said, I'm a compatibilist, I thought, so am I. But I'm a Calvinist compatibilist, and he's a materialist compatibilist. So, well, here we are. So, okay. What does belief in God mean? Well, now we keep sliding down into Peterson's territory, which is, again, why I think, well, Peterson is not only pushing a movement forward, but Peterson is riding a wave that he himself didn't make. And this is why, with all of our internal watchers, people are watching Peterson and they're saying things like, he's saying what I always believed. Why? Because, well, is it a communal consciousness that we're all participating in? Is it cultures of us watching each other? Is it, how does culture work? Do we really know? And here's the vital question: how does God really manage our different cultures? Well, and fortunately, we have a Bible that was written in at least two dominant culture groups. You have the culture of the Old Testament and the culture of the New, and two different languages. Christianity is an unusual religion in that it has, I would argue, more successfully crossed cultural lines than any other major world religion. That's really something to think about. So anyway, this is my framing of Jordan Peterson and Dillahunty. I'll probably Twitch their talk, and we'll go from there.